Welcome to Team 4's presentation. Our team consists of Kate Nicholchuk, Tausif Dola, and myself, Robin Potter. We will assess implications that the proposed twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, TMP, would have in the Georgia Strait and Vancouver's Green City movement from both agency and stewardship theory perspectives. I will briefly define both theories as possible lenses to explore the issue, provide background on the pipeline controversy and the impact it could have on the BC tourism industry, the Strait of Georgia's key stakeholders, as well as the natural environment potentially affected. Tausif will present the DMO dilemma and how it could affect the City of Vancouver and Tourism Vancouver from a stewardship theory perspective, and stakeholders from the agency theory perspective. Kate will then look at the local First Nations and the City of Vancouver, comparing outlooks and what it looks like in practice. Kate will also discuss the triple bottom line and propose a collective values-based management plan. We wish to begin by acknowledging and raising our hands to the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Esquimalt and Songhees families on whose lands we are guests to learn. We also recognize the City of Vancouver as unceded Coast Salish territory. Pillars Institute defines agency theory as a way to organize relationships in which one party determines the work while another party does the work. As it pertains to tourism, the principles represent government agencies delegating the agents, better known as stakeholders, to perform tasks on their behalf. This theory relies on the assumption that both parties are motivated by self-interest and personal economic gain. It is a checks and balance type of governance, monitoring management to avoid problems. Federal government has a vested interest if they believe that the economic gains outweigh the environmental risks, which would be an example of how agency theory is based on self-interest rather than the greater good for all. In the case of Kinder Morgan, National Observer reported that Green Party leader Elizabeth May, representing BC stakeholders opposed to the pipeline, appealed to the Parliament panel by reminding them of the Liberal campaign promises, which included respectful nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations, evidence-based decision-making, science-based decision-making, and action to reduce greenhouse gases. The administration would violate all four of those promises if the pipeline gets approved. In this model, the federal government is the one with more control, and often the goals of the principal and agent conflict, so it is important to find common ground and work toward the collective goals and objectives. Stewardship theory, on the other hand, focuses not on motivation of the person or people at the top, but rather on the empowering structures that enhance effectiveness and protect the interests of the shareholders and make decisions on their behalf. As Newton outlines, stewardship in the broad sense incorporates aspects of our moral code, including the protection of the natural environment. As the pipeline will greatly impact the natural world, stewardship theory is the concept where stakeholders' interests are maximized by shared duties within an organization. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, also known as the Kinder Morgan Pipeline expansion, is named after the Texas-based oil company behind the proposal. The company wants to add 987 kilometers of new pipeline alongside existing pipeline between Edmonton, Vancouver, and Burnaby in order to triple capacity and, as they claim, bring sustainability-extracted resources to new markets overseas, provide jobs, and breathe life into struggling provincial economies. According to a report done by Conversations for Responsible Economic Development, acronym CRED, Kinder Morgan has opted not to conduct any studies on health impacts or the effects on marine environment that shipping bitumen from Alberta's oil sands using the pipeline could affect long term. With a poor safety record, Kinder Morgan has been responsible for 1,800 violations, 500 being pipeline related. Bitumen has a sludgy consistency and is diluted with highly volatile substances to be transported by pipeline. The bitumen and diluent separate once the compound is released into the environment, discharging toxic fumes, while heavier bitumen sinks to the floor of marine environments. According to CRED, 1 liter of diluted bitumen can contaminate 1 million liters of groundwater. The main issues from the stakeholders' perspective boil down to concerns that include an increase in shipping. Additional oil tankers means an increase in tanker traffic, impacts to marine mammals and birds, including the resident and transient orca populations in the strait, which directly impacts the tourism industry, fish populations, water quality, and creates human health risks, particularly to the native communities who rely on these waterways. An increased risk of potential oil spills means greater risk of pipeline ruptures. In 2007, a pipeline rupture in Burnaby caused 250,000 liters of crude oil to flow into the Burrard Inlet Bay and took more than a year to clean up. Kinder Morgan was deemed negligent, but of course, it does not make up for the long-term environmental damage, the local community carrying the environmental and economic burden, and long-term health issues of the population. There is a direct correlation between building the infrastructure for significant oil sands expansion and greenhouse gas emissions. The tar sands are the fastest growing source of emissions in Canada. If already approved plans and permits are implemented in Alberta, production would grow to 5 times what it is currently. Greenhouse gas emissions produced in the extraction process is 3 to 4 times greater from tar sands than a conventional barrel. The tourism industry continues to play a significant role in the British Columbia economy. According to CRED, close to 93,600 jobs are created by tourism in the province. 43% of those jobs are at risk if an oil spill occurs. The tourism industry relies on the natural landscape to attract visitors, so they have a particular interest in preserving the marine ecosystems, wildlife, and First Nations heritage. Tourism is a $14 billion industry and approximately $1.5 billion per year spent on nature-based tourism alone. In terms of revenue earned by tourism businesses, value added to the economy by tourism activities, and creation of employment opportunities, an oil spill would have significant impact on BC's branding and their supernatural reputation. Long-term effects of a spill to the waterways would be catastrophic, far-reaching, and long-lasting. The Strait of Georgia is by far the most important marine region of British Columbia, with 70% of the population of the province located on its periphery and its shores. It lies between Vancouver Island and the BC mainland, about 2/3 the length of the island, running from its southern tip north to where its waters narrow to meet the mainland coastal waterways, including the Fraser River, Squamish River, and Jarvis Inlet. It is essential to residents of the region for income, transportation, recreation, and quality of life. It's a working body of water that supports economic engines for the province, including being a global tourist destination. Looking at this chart are but a few of the key stakeholders on the strait impacted by KMP. First Nations. As the CRED report highlights, many First Nations governments in BC are concerned about the TMP and the resulting increase in coastal tanker traffic. The waters and surrounding lands of the strait are within the traditional territories of many of the Indigenous people who have inhabited and cared for the area for centuries. Any oil spill would impact their ability to practice their way of life, including the ability to hunt, fish, and practice cultural and spiritual traditions. The Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh bands have formally declared opposition to Trans Mountain expansion in a Save the Salish Sea declaration. The declaration expresses concerns about the significant risk to watersheds and the plants, animals, fish, and people who depend on them. While not a market-based industry, fishing provides First Nations communities in the region with a source of food and again holds spiritual and cultural significance. Local communities. The impact to BC residents would also be detrimental if a spill occurred. The new pipeline route would run directly under 3 schools in the Lower Mainland and within a short distance of dozens of additional schools, golf courses, and residential neighborhoods and aquifers that supply drinking water to Abbotsford and Chilliwack. This would lead to potentially long-term or lethal consequences for those living in these communities and puts into question the safety of future generations. Municipal governments. Vancouver's position, which fits with the current council's green agenda, is in strong opposition to the Kinder Morgan proposal. The Lower Mainland Local Government Association, which represents 33 municipalities, including 3 regional districts, also voted to oppose the expansion project. The cities of Burnaby, Surrey, North Vancouver, Chilliwack, Port Moody, and Victoria are included among these. That puts Lower Mainland municipal politicians, usually pro-economic development, on the same side as Aboriginal groups, environmentalists, and area residents. Unfortunately, municipal governments have little power to stop the project if it gains federal approval. Tourism operators. Widespread recreational use of the strait makes tourism in the region a major industry, as previously discussed. Operators, especially those who specifically use the waterways directly or connecting to the strait, would have their livelihoods put at risk along with the natural surroundings their businesses rely on. Environmental organizations. There are a number of organizations currently working to protect the strait. Among the many included are the Rainforest Conservation, Living Oceans Society, Wilderness Committee, UBC University Neighborhood Association, and the Sierra Club. The Georgia Strait Alliance is a citizens group focused on protecting the marine environment in and around the Strait of Georgia. These so-called strait keepers' ongoing studies of intertidal ecology have helped local communities monitor biodiversity and assess the impacts of shoreline development. The waterways along the Georgia Strait are made up of a number of important estuaries, delicate marine ecosystems, and are home to numerous marine and wildlife viewing opportunities, including the recreational areas listed here. In short, the Strait of Georgia is a multiple-use aquatic environment that must be considered a national asset worthy of utmost consideration and protection. Tausif will now address stewardship and agency theory from the stakeholders' perspective.
Thank you, Robin. As we have heard from Robin, there are two distinct theories that are in interplay in our discussion: stewardship theory and agency theory. In my part, I'll further explain why and how agency theory is coming into play amid the overarching theory of stewardship. As Dr. Valerie Shefford likes to say, at the heart of tourism stewardship is the notion of responsibility that includes corporate social responsibility, responsibility in tourism product development, our responsibility as tourists as we travel, and most importantly, the moral responsibility of all the stakeholders. From an agency theory perspective, the stakeholders can be divided into two distinct groups: owners, who are the principal stakeholders, and the managers, also known as agents, working to safeguard the interests of the owners. Within the tourism nexus of Vancouver, as shown on the slide, owners are the local community and businesses, mostly consist of the settlers and immigrants, and the Indigenous community who, despite being the sole owner, often are ignored or long been forgotten. According to Jensen and Meckling, there is an agency loss whenever agents such as national, provincial, or local government, politicians, or the policymakers as a whole, and in our case, destination marketing organizations, are working in their own interests and not in the interests of their owners. Trans Mountain Pipeline, as it has been extensively discussed by Robin, including the looming threat it's posing over Georgia Strait waterways, can be considered as a classic example of such agency loss where the managers fail to pay sufficient attention. Now, why do we think Tourism Vancouver as a destination marketing organization should be considered as an agent? Or how Tourism Vancouver can influence the policymakers or the other agents? To understand, we have to look at Tourism Vancouver's master plan itself. And according to the master plan, Tourism Vancouver as an organization is designed to guide and provide specific recommendations for the policy and planning frameworks that will ensure that the tourism industry grows in a manner that is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable, and thus able to meet the future needs of residents, visitors, investors, and other stakeholders, or the owners. However, Tourism Vancouver's mission statement is primarily focused on economic growth, attract more visitors, get them to stay longer, spend more, and say wonderful things about Vancouver in return. Obviously, this can benefit the local community, but as of now, but not in the long run, and eventually may cause tremendous agency loss. Most importantly, Tourism Vancouver as one of the key stakeholders that is benefiting hugely from Georgia Strait corridor that is feeding all the beautiful waterways around Vancouver, has done least to influence them or impact the policymakers to reject or restrain Trans Mountain Pipeline. As a key player in destination promotion, as Pennington and Thapa has suggested, DMOs need to take responsibility for educating people, whether they are tourists or locals, because they are the one who have the power to influence the policy and the policymakers. City of Vancouver has sufficiently acted against Trans Mountain Pipeline. Besides, the Greener City Action Plan is truly commendable. Tourism Vancouver is already internationally recognized as a city that meets the needs of generations to come. However, despite City of Vancouver's effort and its citizens' effort against Trans Mountain Pipeline, in January 2017, provincial government has signed a treaty with Kinder Morgan, allowing them to continue with their project named Trans Mountain Pipeline. According to CBC, this treaty is unprecedented. Maybe it is time for City of Vancouver, Tourism Vancouver, and also the provincial government to take a deeper look at their management practices. And that is something will be presented by Kate in the next phase of our presentation. Over to Kate. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Vancouver City Council declared 2014 a year of reconciliation, an acknowledgement of the BC's treaties process and the healing that needs to happen between the City of Vancouver and local First Nations survivors of colonialism. The city began by recognizing the unceded territory of Vancouver's 3 traditional Coast Salish nations. Unceded is a legal term that means Aboriginal title is a right to the land itself, not just particular resource use. And since most of BC didn't have treaties, Aboriginal title is still the law of the land, literally. So what does this mean for stewardship? A series of Supreme Court decisions have confirmed that the provincial and national governments must properly consult with and accommodate the interests of BC's First Nations before proceeding with developments on traditional territories or things that might impact traditional territories. So how has that robust consultation gone so far? Well, as an artistic metaphor, Celtic artist Ian Reid carved this mask of Yagus, a sea monster figure, gobbling up a trespassing Enbridge pipeline oil tanker. So there's a lot of room for improvement, to say the least. And while cities do not have a seat at the modern treaty table, the recognition of unceded territory is a gesture towards reconciliation, certainty, shared interest, and joint stewardship, and so on. Land rights and resource use have been at the center of colonial tensions with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit since contact. But ecological ethics have been a part of Aboriginal stewardship since time immemorial. Can there be a reconciliation between settler and Coast Salish ecological ethics and management practices with tourism of the Strait of Georgia? While the ground rules for access, rights, and relationships to resources are, of course, specific to each nation, sometimes specific families, overarchingly, Keith Thor Carlson, an archaeologist who worked with Stalo Nation, might suggest we start by asking, what should the world look like in 240 years? And what if the voices of our great-great-great-great-grandparents, aunts and uncles, and our great-great-great-great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews, had equal say in decision-making? What would our democracy look like if they, as active citizens, were allowed to vote? If we were equally accountable to not only our future generations, but our pre-colonial past? This is part of what academics might call the 7th generation philosophy, also known as earth ethics or eco-justice or intergenerational ethics. In Hachamilam, the regional language of the Stalo people, the correct term might be Temikwe, a relational word for identity and family bonds between present, past, and future generations. In settler society, since 1994, John Elkington's triple bottom line of profit, people, and planet, which we've pictured on the left, has been the standard for corporate sustainability. The City of Vancouver, for example, has a triple bottom line that fits Elkington's model and incorporates the city's altruistic environmental and social aspirations as well as its economic goals. Notably, though Vancouver's triple bottom line acknowledges Coast Salish unceded territory, it doesn't really include in a meaningful way indigenization or life cycle tourism development anywhere within the actual strategy. And even if it did, can corporate responsibility frameworks really capture Coast Salish stewardship ethics? Increasingly, tourism scholarship speaks about a quadruple bottom line. The literature doesn't always agree on what that fourth pillar is. Is it people, profit, places, and purpose, prosperity, or maybe spiritual and cultural vitality? The jury is out. But Walters and Takamura have suggested that we need a decolonized quadruple bottom line for Indigenous innovation based on community, spirituality, sustainability, and entrepreneurship, which we've imagined visually on the left. It's important to note that the authors have replaced economics with entrepreneurship, and they focus on business innovation rather than development. There are small but important differences, because ultimately, within a Western globalized economy, the bottom line is always profit, and profit defined within very narrow terms. Triple bottom lines include a calculated commodification of social and environmental growth and damage, but then that's accounted for financially, in the same way as we always do. Entrepreneurship, rather than economics, calculates costs in slightly different terms. And innovation here is about process and moving towards sustainable institutional change, not just simply the development of better products or places. We can also try and indigenize Vancouver's renewable city vision by making it 3D. By 3D, I mean adding an extra dimension, which is time. 7 generations forwards and backwards from a present that is based on reciprocal relationships, self-determination, and shared stewardship. Also importantly, we need to add sustainable tourism that looks at the life cycle vitality of its communities within the actual strategies that this vision creates. Dr. Viola Cordova, the first American Indigenous doctor of philosophy, would suggest that professional associations have a really hard time deciding what is right and moral actions because they can't agree on a foundational ethical underpinning. In the West, especially when it comes to settler-Indigenous relationships and land rights, a lot of our thinking comes from the Enlightenment era and philosophers like Calvin and Hobbes. In settler society, the I, or the individual, is the ultimate bargaining unit, according to Hobbes at least. And he sees individuals as being naturally at war with one another and in a constant state of competition. Alternatively, according to Cordova, Indigenous North Americans look at the collective, the we, not the I, and understand the fundamental nature of human beings as being social and not based on conflict. This need for an ethical alternative is foundational for decolonial Kapapa Maori and political science scholars like India's Gayatri Spivak, Aotearoa New Zealand's Linda Tui-Y-Smith, and Canada's Taiaiake Alfred, respectively. A better way forward is not so much about learning how to do things better, but unlearning the assumptions behind the epistemologies, methods, and ethics that we use now. So we know that there's a divide between settler and Indigenous understandings of water stewardship and the Strait of Georgia. But what are our tools to start building a bridge based on reconciliation, recognition, and resurgence? Because tourism is a major industry in BC with huge potential for further development. But it's also difficult to discipline. It's highly competitive, trend-driven, and dynamic, all of which makes policymaking extraordinarily difficult. In 2002, Simon Fraser University held a conference on coastal tourism led by both Indigenous and settler thought leaders, and they laid out a roadmap for the coastal tourism industry. Here are some suggestions that they had. To define institutional and legislative jurisdictional uncertainties for all the stakeholders, and this includes an understanding of the BCTC and modern treaties process. To focus on an appropriate education and an understanding of culture values that ensures that Aboriginal people's views of the resources are acknowledged and included in the policy-making process. To improve monitoring and enforcement for effective and sustainable tourism. This might involve devolving decision-making down to the local level, as communities have more knowledge to be able to deal with the realities of the decisions. Integrate environmental stewardship strategies to protect the people and the environment. Integrate human resources, education, and business development. This would stimulate the development and optimization of community benefits. Ensure a strong level of commitment to tourism by decision makers, like the provincial government, in order to view tourism as a long-term process. Identify best practices that might act as benchmarks. These would provide key principles on which to build sustainable tourism ventures in the future. Builds capacity for First Nations communities to initiate, improve, and sustain tourism ventures. This includes provincial funding and partner development opportunities. Integrate the various institutional agencies. This involves improved communication and collaboration between agencies that already exist. Enhance the link between education and policy making. We can do this by supporting and encouraging academic research. There's a considerable amount of opportunities for academic collaboration with government agencies and First Nations in coastal and oceans tourism research. We are going to leave you with a promotional video from Vancouver Tourism and a contemporary Salish song from Chilliwack's Innes Jasper. We challenge you to consider the use of images of waterways and indigeneity in these videos and ask what responsibilities come alongside that as individuals, as members of the tourism industry.
A time ago, it was said we'd be dead or walking on the other side.